Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So here's a headline that might make you do a double take. Mexico sent rescue teams and water to help Texas. Yup, not the other way around. Earlier this year, Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum sent firefighters and rescue crews into Texas after catastrophic floods. Additionally, Mexico pledged to deliver water to Texas farmers tied to obligations under the 1944 Water Treaty. Now, on the surface, that's an incredible gesture of goodwill. But step back and look at the bigger picture, and you start to see cracks in the American facade. Because how did one of America's wealthiest, proudest states end up needing foreign aid? And that, my friends, brings us to a question that makes a lot of people squirm. Is the United States starting to look a little bit like the late Roman Empire? Let's break it down. All right, let's start in Texas. Let's talk about Hurricane Harvey in 2017. You remember it? It basically turned Houston into a lake. Some neighborhoods got 50 inches of rain. It took 10 days just to restore power for 75% of Houston. Some people waited nearly 2 weeks for the lights to come back on. You'd think once the water receded, the city would bounce back fast. Nope. A year later, many folks were still displaced. 5 years later, surveys said about 82% of people were mostly or fully recovered. But that still left tens of thousands whose homes were wrecked or neighborhoods hadn't rebuilt. Some experts said the full recovery could stretch into the next decade, or longer. And that's just one disaster. Since then, Texas has been getting slammed. Hurricane Beryl ice storms that knocked out the grid in 2021, leaving millions freezing in their homes, heat waves, melting power lines, a grid that's constantly teetering on the edge. And now Mexico is sending water and firefighters. If that's not a sign of stress, I don't know what is. But Texas isn't alone in this story. Let's rewind to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Over 1,800 people died. Whole sections of New Orleans vanished underwater. Power stayed out for weeks. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned for years. A decade later, the lower Ninth Ward still looked bombed out. Some people never came back. For them, Katrina wasn't just a storm, it was a permanent dislocation. The official line is that New Orleans recovered. And yes, it's an amazing city again, but many neighborhoods and families never fully healed. And here's the thing. Disasters like Harvey and Katrina show how vulnerable American cities can be. For all our wealth and technology, the cracks are showing. And that's where the Rome comparison starts to make sense. So let's ask the uncomfortable question, have we ever seen a superpower with staggering wealth on paper, dealing with crumbling infrastructure, natural disasters, political turmoil, and sometimes needing help from outsiders? Yeah, we have. It was called the Western Roman Empire. Let's dig in. In Rome's later centuries, the elites were freaking out because they believed there were fewer real Romans left. Writers like Tacitus complained that the upper classes didn't want to marry or have kids. The government tried all sorts of incentives. Tax breaks for families with 3 or more kids, called the Jus Trium Liberorum. Special privileges for parents who had large families. Despite this, Roman census records show citizen numbers shrinking, especially in the cities. And you know what? America's facing something similar. The US fertility rate is under 2.0, below replacement. Politicians are worrying about how to fund Social Security and Medicare. There's a heated debate about whether immigration should fill the gaps. Rome worried about its citizen population. America's having those same conversations. Let's talk about how Rome's economy worked. Rome basically ran on slave labor. When Rome conquered new territories, they captured tons of slaves. Huge estates called latifundia were worked by slaves instead of free citizens. Small farmers got pushed out of business because they couldn't compete with free labor. Writers like Pliny the Elder and Columella warned that Rome was destroying its own social fabric. And while America doesn't have slavery today, there's a modern version of that economic trap: cheap labor. In America, immigrants, many undocumented, do back-breaking jobs, picking crops, cleaning buildings, working in construction. Wages stay low because there's always someone desperate enough to take the job. Short-term, it keeps costs down for businesses and consumers. But it creates a two-tier society. One group lives comfortably, the other barely scrapes by. It's eerily like late Rome, where an elite few grew richer while everyone else fell behind. Another big piece of the puzzle, Rome's military. At the start, Rome had maybe 250,000 soldiers, but by the 4th century the army ballooned to over 600,000. And guess what? Armies are expensive. Pay went up. Food and supplies cost a fortune. Emperors started debasing the currency, mixing cheaper metals into coins to make them stretch further. It triggered hyperinflation. Prices went crazy. Trust in money collapsed. Fast forward to America. The US defense budget is nearly $800 billion a year. That's more than the next 10 countries combined. And while America can afford it better than Rome ever could, critics argue that pouring so much into defense leaves less for roads, bridges, public transit, or disaster preparedness. Rome's military spending didn't cause the collapse. It was the tipping point that exposed all the cracks beneath. Here's where Rome gets fascinating. As citizen numbers dropped, Rome filled its legions with foreigners. Goths, Vandals, Sarmatians, Huns. These groups often served under their own chieftains and retained their own cultures. One famous example, Stilicho, who was half Vandal but became Rome's top general. Roman historians worried endlessly, are these guys loyal or will they switch sides if things get rough? In the US today, the military is mostly American-born, but similar debates exist about loyalty and identity. Who counts as a real American? Are immigrants truly loyal to the US or just here for opportunity? Those cultural fractures create tension, especially when crises hit. Let's talk migration. In the late 4th century, the Goths crossed the Danube to escape the Huns. Rome let them in as refugees, but then officials starved and extorted them. So the Goths rebelled. In 378 CE, they crushed Rome at the Battle of Adrianople. Over the next decades, other groups poured in. Vandals, Suebi, Alans, Huns. Sometimes the locals literally opened the gates because they'd lost faith in Rome's protection. Sound familiar? Today in Southern California and other places, anti-ICE protests block deportation buses. Cities declare themselves sanctuary zones. Communities help immigrants hide from federal enforcement. Of course, migrants today aren't invaders like the Huns, but the dynamic is the same. Local communities choose loyalty to people they know over distant government authorities. It's all about legitimacy. Who do you trust? Rome's collapse wasn't just about barbarians with swords, it was about infrastructure decay and lost faith. Roofs caved in on public buildings, roads crumbled. Cities shrank as elites retreated to walled villas. People stopped believing Rome could keep the lights on or the aqueducts flowing. Fast forward to today, Texas's grid failures, flooded highways in Houston, water shortages so bad that Mexico has to ship water across the border. When a foreign country sends rescue teams into Texas, it's not just a goodwill gesture, it's a red flag about whether the US can handle its own crises. So, is the US doomed like Rome? No, not automatically. America has a strong economy. We have democratic institutions. Immigrants today want to integrate, not overthrow the government. But here's the warning from history. Even the strongest empires fall when infrastructure decays. People stop believing the government serves them. Local communities start making their own deals because they've lost faith in central authority. Mexico sending aid to Texas should make us pause. Are we still capable of taking care of our own people without outside help? Or are we inching closer to looking like late Rome, a superpower on paper, hollowed out from within? Because Rome fell not just from external enemies, but because its own people stopped believing. And that, my friends, is worth thinking about. Did this video make you feel uncomfortable? Good, that's the point. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us what you think.